So I think we can start now. Welcome everyone to today's e-learning session on changing the world, concepts and practices of women's movements. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Seeing you all from so many different locations. Can everyone hear me okay?
Thank you.
Great. Okay. As I said, I would like to welcome everyone today. My name is Leila Medan-Hodzic, and I work with AWID, with the Constituency and Engagement team. We're very excited to have you join us today, and we appreciate you making it from seeing you in so many different time zones. We will still have a few participants joining, but we have a pretty good turnout at the moment, about 33. And just before we begin, I would like to introduce you to some guidelines and some ground rules to optimize the session for everyone. So I would like to start with the technical side. We would please ask you to not turn on your videos, as this will slow down the connection. And also please make sure to mute your mics, which are just above the participant list, unless you're speaking. Please make sure to use the chat box to exchange your thoughts, opinions, ask questions, also talk to other participants. And if during the question and answer session or part of the session, you're also welcome to raise your hand, which is a button just above the participant list. And then the moderator or the facilitator will call on you to speak. And after that, we'll please ask you to mute your mic again. Also on the right-hand side is the whiteboard where you can see the presentation. We ask you to please not push any buttons on that side, as that is only for the facilitators to use. And in the chat box, if you agree with something somebody's saying, you can also type in a plus sign. Or if you disagree, you can type in a minus sign. If there's any questions, you're welcome to ask. I hope that the technical side is pretty clear. Okay, now I would like to introduce our two facilitators today, Srilata Bhatliwala and Janet Price. Srilata joins us from Bangalore, India. She's a feminist activist and researcher, and currently, and since 2007, an associate scholar at AWID. Srilata has an amazing wealth of experience and has worked for gender equality and women's empowerment for the last 40 years. She has done this work through grassroots activism, advocacy, research, training, building theory from practice, and organizational building. Sri has also written extensively on women's issues and is well known for her publications on women's empowerment, transnational civil society, women's movements, feminist leadership, and monitoring and evaluation of women's rights. And her current work focuses on feminist movement building, measuring the impact of women's rights work, and building the analytical and strategic capacity of young women activists. So thank you, Srilata, for joining us today. I would also like to introduce Janet Price, who is a feminist and a disability justice activist with over 30 years of involvement in feminist politics. Janet is the author of The Seeds of a Movement, Disabled Women and Their Struggle to Organize. She's also the vice chair of Data Fest, which is a disability and deaf arts organization that runs a fabulous arts festival, which pulls together disability artists from the UK and from an increasingly international range. Janet's political activities increasingly through web-based alliances and seeing she moves between different locations. And she also works with CREA, which is based in India, and is a feminist sexuality and rights organization, amongst others. Janet also teaches on and off, both in the flesh and on the web, as she says, and she writes reports and papers, conference presentations, and journal articles. Janet has written on feminist postmodern approaches to health, disability, and sexuality, and on women organizing around this issue. And thank you so much, Janet, also for joining us today. Now I would like to give the mic to Srilata.
Hi, thanks so much, Leila, for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? Just if a couple of people can just type in yes if you can hear me clearly. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Before I begin the presentation, let me add my welcome to all of you. This is the second in a series of web-based sessions that we're holding on women's movements and the practices of women's movements, and to clarify our concepts about what is a movement and what is movement building. This is based on a strand of work that AVID has been engaged in since early 2008 or even mid-2007. And I just want to say a few words about why we at AVID felt that this was an important set of issues for us to engage with and to get our members around the world engaged in thinking about. One of the key problems that we have faced over the last let's say 15 years, but particularly after the 1995 World Conference on Women in Beijing, is that until then, there was a great deal of attention and focus within women's organizations, among women's rights activists and advocates, on building movements. And there was a very strong feeling that the way to really change gender relations, the structures of power that discriminate against women, is to build processes of change that have a mass base and lots of women involved in a process of change. But over time, what happened was that these approaches, which we call the women's empowerment approach, which really focused on changing attitudes and beliefs as well as laws and policies, was that there were an increasing amount of NGOization that happened, and also donor policies began to change. So more and more the kinds of interventions that were being supported were kind of piecemeal. So many of the successful strategies that women's movements had developed, like giving women access to credit and productive resources, or getting women into political offices, kind of got pulled out of the broader change processes of which they were a part, and they became kind of little magic bullets or specific interventions that donors began to support. So that what began to fall away was the emphasis on the larger movement building process. People began to set up organizations and run projects, and we kind of lost sight of the larger goal. So changing their world, the concepts and practices of women's movements was one of the first attempts to regain a focus on movement building and to get us thinking about that again. But instead of sitting down and writing a big theoretical volume on social movements and women's movements and feminist movements, what we did was what AVID really does best, which is we went out into the field and we studied a large number of women's movements on the ground in all parts of the world, in all the continents, in all the regions of the world. We also, in 2010, added additional case studies which were based on movements of very marginalized and excluded women, and in fact groups of women that even mainstream women's movements had largely neglected or excluded unintentionally or intentionally. So we did another 4 case studies, for example, of disabled women's movement building, the sex workers movements, movements of women in conflict areas, movements of lesbian women in poor communities, and so on. So what we're presenting to you today, which I'm going to move into in a minute, is the conceptual framework that has emerged out of this study of actual movements on the ground. So it's not a lot of theory. However, this theoretical framework is informed also by the work that I did for many years when I was at Harvard University's Kennedy School on the theories about social movements. So in a sense, what we're trying to present to you is a synthesis of both what we've learned from practice as well as what we've learned from looking at the theory. So are you ready? Shall we move now into the presentation on understanding movements and why they matter? Okay, let's go then. So what we're going to do in this presentation is to start, as I always like to do, with a definition of what is a movement. But before I do that, I'd like to go back to the poll. I think you received a set of questions from us, and I wondered how many of you thought about the first two questions and how many of you would like to take this poll at this moment. We have a little box here that you can tick to say yes or no. So I'm going to ask you to quickly vote and tell us how many of you have participated in or been associated with or helped build a movement. Can you see the little tick box next to the raised hand? You can use that to vote. Okay, so far we have 17. 18. Okay, that's fantastic. We have almost half the participants in this session have participated in or been associated with or actively involved in helping build a movement. Let's go to the second question, which is whether you've participated in or helped build a women's rights movement, a movement focused specifically on women's rights. So we're going to start again. How many of you have been involved in a women's rights movement in some way? Okay, so we have 19 people who've been involved in some kind of women's rights organizing work, some kind of movement building work around the rights of women. So that's fantastic. Again, about half the group. Now, based on this involvement, what I'd like us to do now is to really get your insights on what you found are some of the core characteristics of these movements you've been associated with. What distinguishes them from, say, other approaches? What makes a movement different? Feel free to share. You can either share by raising your hand, and I can call on you and ask you to speak about your experience of what makes a movement different or what are its special characteristics and what are the things that a movement can achieve or change, especially for women, that other processes run by NGOs, projects, and so on can't do. Is there anyone who would like to speak to this subject based on your experience of what makes a movement different?
Sri, I think Kirti and Shweta and Anita have their hands raised.
Can I ask you to call on them, Leila?
Sure. So, Kirti, would you like to speak? You can push the talk button.
Sure. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Is this clear?
Yes, yes. Please go ahead.
Sure. What I'm going to say is that the movements that I've participated in have all come from one perspective or one standpoint, that the women we were working with were not unempowered or women who needed help, but were the catalysts and the forces of change themselves. So in that sense, we were a movement because we were dynamic, right from the people who were doing the work and the people who were involved with.
I'm not sure if you understood that, Sri. Kirti, there was not a good connection. Maybe you can try type in your comments. Maybe that will work better.
But I think she has actually.
Okay.
That the movements, Kirti, what I'm hearing is that the movements you participated in came from a standpoint that women were not unempowered or in need of help, but that they could be catalysts and elements of change. Okay, so that's one characteristic of a movement, is that it considers the people who are part of it as capable of creating a change. Mathura says movements can achieve a lot of things, but it's a lengthy process, that it's a long-term change. Julia says they have been using the internet to build a transnational movement, so it's actually sort of movements getting built in other kinds of spaces, more virtual processes. I think Elena says women movements in Poland are still at the embryonic stage, very few organizations. And again, Kirti says, yeah, okay, so she's repeated her point. Movement occupies a political space, says Shweta, whereas projects can be target-based. So, Shweta, can I ask you to say a little bit more about that? That's an interesting point, that a movement occupies a political space. What do we mean by that?
Hi, can you hear me actually? Is this better or should I type it in?
No, it's great.
No, I can hear you very clearly, yeah. Is that Shweta?
Yes, this is Shweta. So I think
Yeah,
what I meant to
ahead.
say actually was operate in a, what I meant to say was movements operate in a political space, and I think that was a typo. But what I meant by that, I think that, that they work towards sort of politicizing certain aspects of aspects that a women's organization might already be working on, but I work for an organization that works for abortion rights. So our projects are just meant to increase access or something like that, where there is an unmet need and we try to increase access to that need. But I think a movement is supposed to increase acceptance for abortion as a whole, or so there is a general. It moves from that target-based thing where you're just providing people with what they want or don't want, to actually empowering them to think more broadly about the topic and to sort of like I think you mentioned earlier that it's when there were more NGOs or when donor policies changed, there were more magic bullets kind of operations and the political movements.
Okay, I think we lost you.
Hello?
Yes, Shweta, we can hear you.
Yeah, no, so I was just saying almost the same thing, that that we don't have a target-based thing, but we're actually trying to sort of politicize certain aspects. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's a great point. We also have an interesting point from Akini that the LGBT movement in Kenya, for instance, is very donor-driven and has, as a result, spawned a lot of splinter groups. Akini, do you want to say something more about that? Can you speak, or would you like to type your point?
I'll try and speak. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, very clearly.
Yeah, well, the LGBT movement in Kenya started off as a coalition, gay and lesbian coalition of Kenya, and has grown to include trans and intersex groups and individuals.
Yeah.
But with time, what I noticed and what I have seen is that, you know, we can't really operate much without money. And so, and the money has been sort of coming from a specific number of donors. And then as the groups have grown, there's been more and more competition and also conflict within the organization. So it sort of spawned splinter groups, which is good in a way, but at the same time, I'm not sure what, I mean, the extent of the impacts that has had on the movement as such, even though that, of course, it does contribute to extensive discussions and conversations surrounding LGBT issues across the country. So in a way it's good, but it has its drawbacks as well.
Yeah, I think the point you're making is that if there are more organizations working on the issues of specific groups of sexual minorities, that's fine, but unless that sort of constellation of groups is able to form some kind of a larger political front, a political voice, and, you know, speak together on LGBT issues, then is it really strengthening a movement or is it splintering it? I think that's a very good point that you're making. Hello? Hello?
Yes, Ree, I can hear you fine.
Yeah, okay. I'm just reading the point that Sandra has put in, that at an earlier stage, religious and social groupings and the subsequent formation of women's organizations and the women's movement in Uganda has continued to question patriarchy and contributed towards reshaping sociocultural practices and national governance structures. So I think that's a great point, that movements work at multiple levels and on sort of multiple facets of power structures, and they recognize, for instance, that there is a power structure called patriarchy. A women's rights movement would really recognize the existence of power relations based on patriarchy and look at reshaping practices and cultural norms, social norms, as well as governance systems. So that's great. Maybe this is a good point at which we can take in the presentation and then come back again to hear a few more views, because maybe the presentation will also help to frame and capture many of the very good points that have been made in our opening discussion. So what I want to start with is a definition of a movement. And it's actually, a movement is quite simple to define, but there's some very powerful concepts embedded in the definition. We define a movement as an organized set of people vested in making a change in their situation, that is, who recognize where their interests lie and what in feminist literature is often called strategic interests. And so they are vested in making a change in their situation to advance those interests. And together, they build a common political agenda, and they pursue that political agenda through collective action. Now, why do we call it a political agenda? It's not because they're going to go off and form a political party and contest elections. We don't use the word political in the small p sense. We use the word political to talk about power. So whenever a group of people is addressing a set of power relations, a power structure, and they construct an agenda to change that power structure, we call that a political agenda. So in short, a movement is an organized set of people vested in a particular direction of change, and they pursue a common political agenda through collective action. So let's look then at what are some of the key characteristics of movements. And I'm really happy because several of these characteristics have already come out in the discussion. And if you go through the very, very rich range of case studies in the Changing Their World document, you'll find a lot of these characteristics that will jump out at you. But first and foremost, of course, a movement is an organized constituency. It's not, individuals randomly gathering for a protest or an uprising. Those kinds of things happen all the time when there's a grave injustice, when there has been a terrible kind of oppression, when there's an oppressive state, for instance. We've seen this a few years ago in the uprisings across the Arab world, and we continue to see it in many parts of the world. But those uprisings are only a beginning. We don't call that a movement. It's when people become organized, when they form collectives, they start creating structures through which they sit together continuously and start talking about the issues and thinking about action. So that's what transforms the set of individuals or groups who are interested in a particular change to come together and form an organized constituency. And you recognize this because you see that movements have these organizational substructures. Most of them will be informal. You'll have neighborhood committees, member collectives. In South Asia, we often call them sanghas or samoos, women's collectives, groups at the village level or the neighborhood level, networks, other kinds of organizations. But the point is that every movement, as it grows, has to create an infrastructure for participation, representation, and decision making so that all its members can feel a part of that movement. And that's why we could call it an organized constituency base, because we see those substructures. Of course, the political agenda is a key characteristic. Again, this is what distinguishes a movement, for instance, from a social change organization or even an NGO, and from perhaps an uprising, a spontaneous uprising, which may have a limited, sharp political goal of the short term. But movements have a longer term political agenda, and this political agenda emerges out of a shared analysis of the problem, a shared analysis usually of the power dynamic that is resulting in their exclusion or their oppression. The political agenda also contains clear goals of change and targets for change. Who are they going to work with? Who are they going to challenge in order to bring about the change that they seek? Again, and I think some of you mentioned this, maybe this was also implicit in Kirti's point, that a movement always has leadership from the constituency base. And it's at multiple levels. It's never dependent on external leadership. And I want to emphasize this point because I think all of us come across this phenomenon of NGO leaders, even women's organization leaders, describing themselves as a movement. But actually, you can't see the constituency base. You can't find any leadership from the constituency at the highest levels of the change process. So this is a very key characteristic that we have to look for and that movement building processes have to do. And I see that one of you is from an organization that focuses on leadership building. Is it Footsteps, I believe? So if we are really interested in movement building, we have to look at building leadership from the bottom up. We also see collective actions of various kinds in pursuit of their goals. Some of this can be through strategies of engagement, working with, for instance, state actors or other actors in alliances and partnerships, but it can also be confrontational and contest some kind of power structure, challenge a power structure through an act of protest or defiance. I mean, the labor movement had its classic strategy of a strike, tools down, a walkout, a lockout, etc. And finally, I think another key characteristic of a movement is the continuity over time. And this is one of the things that actually distinguishes movements from uprisings or short-term campaigns, is that they tend to build up and stay the course over a period of time. Now, this is not because, as one of you said, movement building is a slow process. On the contrary, I have myself been involved in a movement building process where a movement with pretty much all these characteristics emerged within 3 years. Now, if you look at that from a historical lens, that's a very short space of time. So it's not about that it takes a long time to build a movement. Sometimes movements can be built in a very short period of time if there's a sufficient feeling of outrage. But it's about the fact that movements stay the course. They survive, they have continuity over time. They don't just rise up and do something and then disband. They tend to stay the course. So moving on, this is just a quick reminder, I won't spend much time on this, that even reactionary and fundamentalist movements will have a lot of these characteristics. So if in each of your contexts you think about a movement that is very antithetical to human rights, that is anti-gender equality, that's working for some kind of very fundamentalist agenda or a reactionary agenda, chauvinistic agenda, but it will have the same characteristics. So what distinguishes our movements, progressive movements, from these is that we believe in the full body of human rights, or at least we should believe in the full body of human rights. And many reactionary movements do not accept gender equality, for instance, as a goal. They do not accept the rights of people of all sexual identities or equality based on religion, ethnicity, race, caste, etc. So this is what distinguishes us. So if this is what is a movement, then what is a women's movement? Well, a women's movement has all these characteristics, but there are 2 or 3 particularities about it. The political agenda of a women's movement is always framed around meeting the needs of women, usually a practical needs of women, but it could also be about advancing their longer-term strategic interests. Now, I'll come back to this point and we'll talk a little bit about it. The constituency base of a women's movement is primarily women, though they often also have male members. And finally, the leadership will, of course, be mainly by women. But what is a feminist movement? And what is the difference between a feminist movement and any women's movement? A feminist movement, whether it calls itself feminist or not, is not important. Please let me emphasize that. A large number of women's movements are feminist movements, but they don't necessarily use that label for a number of reasons which we can go into in discussion. But the point is that a feminist movement consciously embraces feminist values, ideology, and most importantly, an analytical framework and methods. So its agenda is based on an analysis of patriarchal power relations as they are embedded in all the other structures of power. And they have a feminist analysis of the situation that they are seeking to change. And I invite you to think of an example. We've had an interesting example thrown up, for instance, about abortion and access to abortion. So that would be a practical need So you can have a women's movement that says women should have access to contraception and to medical termination of pregnancy with safety and security and without stigma. That's meeting a practical need. A feminist movement would take that same issue and go further and say women have a right to control their own sexuality and their reproductive lives. That is the real goal. They must have equality in their sexual relationships, in their reproductive relationships. That's the change we really want. And we see access to abortion and other forms of contraception or birth control as a practical need that will help us to move towards this longer-term strategic goal of liberating women from their sexuality and their reproduction being controlled by the family or the husband or whatever is the intimate power structure in which they live. So a feminist movement has feminist political goals that seek a change that goes beyond practical needs and really transforms or seeks to transform structures of gender power and social power. And it uses feminist strategies, and I'm going to leave that one to you guys to think of examples of what are feminist strategies and why they're different. Okay, moving on, how the movements begin. We've seen recently how even a spark, an incident, can ignite outrage. We had this enormous uprisings across India after the Delhi December 16th rape and murder of a young woman. Now, whether that is really morphing into a larger movement around violence against women is something we have to look for, we have to see. It also begins through very conscious movement building interventions, where the goal of the organization is to build a movement and they move in to work with the constituency to mobilize them around that agenda. And then there are a number of other forms that, for lack of time, I'm not going into, but we can discuss later. So what is movement building? It's a process that has at least these 6 key features, and we can add many other features to it. But the critical thing is organizing those people, the constituency that is marginalized, discriminated, that experiences the injustice every day, to build their collective power, to build their structures of organizing themselves to fight for change. Because we know that individuals can't fight for change and sustain it. It has to be done through collectives. And then this organized base of people build their agenda for change, the political agenda. They undertake collective actions in pursuit of the change they're seeking. And these changes, if it's a real, genuine, transformative movement building process, will have at least 3 kinds of targets. One would be securing rights and entitlements. A second would be to transform institutions and structures. And for instance, feminist movements would look at the family as an institution. They won't just look at external structures like a particular law or a policy or a lack of access to a bank loan. They look at institutions like the family, like caste, like clan, and community. And finally, one of the very critical things movements do is to challenge the ideologies that justify this marginalization. So movements, because of their analysis, understand the role that ideology and belief systems and our mental structures play in sustaining injustice. So they focus a lot on that dimension. So these are the sort of key steps in a movement building process. We can come back and look at this later on in greater detail if you wish, but this is just to give you a sense of how the process goes. I usually use this as an animated slide to show you how the steps unfold, but again, it's, let me use the pointer. So you start with the perception of injustice. You have some inspired, determined leaders who decide this is not okay, we need to make a change. They raise the consciousness of others suffering from the same problem by creating a space in which women can come together or people affected can come together to talk about the problem. They build a political agenda, they get mobilized and organized, they start identifying action strategies and priorities, they act for change, and when they act for change, a number of things happen. They may have some gains, they face backlash because they become visible, the participation base expands because there are a lot of people during this process who were sitting on the sidelines here somewhere and saying, okay, let's wait and watch and see. Or these women think they're going to change the world, well, I'm not getting involved. But when they act for change and some gains or some shifts begin to happen, a lot more people start to get involved in the movement and say, okay, we'll join too. The movement then analyzes the situation, they build a new advanced political agenda and new strategies for change. So this is just like a very quick and dirty way of looking at the movement building process. And I think Janet in her presentation will speak to why this is so difficult. Some of these steps that seem simple enough can be extraordinarily challenging for some constituencies. And so moving on, we've seen movements go through these trajectories of, emerging and slowly building and then maturing and becoming quite successful, having quite a high impact. And then you see movements in eclipse and decay and dying out as well. That happens too. So if we take the example that Akini shared of the process of movements in the making, how do we sometimes find that people have difficulty going from this stage to the emerging movement stage is where they start splintering over here, so that the movement can't really start to emerge as a larger, more powerful voice and presence, political presence in a change process. So to conclude with this big question of why do movements matter, why can't NGOs and women's organizations dedicated to social change achieve the same result? So to explain this, I like to use the gender at work framework because I think it's really an excellent tool. This framework has two transversals from the individual to the systemic and from the informal to the formal. So it says change has to happen from the individual level to the systemic level. So you go from individual, family, community, maybe the larger social structures in which they're living, and then the state and the law enforcement system and so on at the systemic level. But change also has to happen in the informal domains in which we live, like our families, like our clans and our villages and so on, where a lot of cultural norms and beliefs and practices operate very strongly in how we conduct ourselves and what we believe our rights are. But more than that, we have very strongly internalized attitudes, values, and practices at the individual level. And this is what feminists call consciousness, people's own sense of what are their rights and what are their privileges and possibilities. The whole area of self-image and self-esteem and so on comes here. And on the right-hand side, of course, we have individual access to and control over resources, inheritance rights, property rights, access to a loan, land ownership, whatever it is. And of course, at the formal systemic level, we have our constitution, our laws, our various economic and social development policies, and budgets and so on. So the basic point is that history seems to show that, yes, NGOs and women's organizations are pretty effective in these two areas. They're good at improving individual access to resources, giving women access to abortion, loans, help training women to get into political office, to run businesses, whatever. We're good at this part. And we're also quite good at this. We do very good advocacy. We've changed, laws to be more gender sensitive, for instance, and so on. But these are the domains in which organizations are not able to impact as deeply as movements can. So movements, because the movement comprises this constituency. It is people living in these individual and systemic structures who get together to create the change. So the changing and shifting of norms and practices, which some of you have already mentioned examples of, is something movements have been far more successful at. But movements have also been successful in these two domains. So this is a strong reason for those of us who believe in human rights, in gender equality, in changing all forms of social and economic and political discrimination and exclusion, to really think about movement building as a transformative strategy. And this is a quote I have just to capture the point of how we've become so NGOized that Joyce Wynn from Zimbabwe says, we are now in a world in which so-called advocacy, which you can read as lobbying and taking members of parliament to a nice workshop, is a strategy of choice. But getting more women at the table is another. But unless these women and these lobbying activities are backed up by the power of numbers, by the power of women who speak for themselves and have strong movements, then change is never going to be sustainable, and in some cases, it won't come. So, this is why movements matter. They can bring down multiple barriers, create change in formal and informal norms, and at the same time, movements have deep structures. That is, they have an open, overt set of goals and analysis, which is usually very lofty, very large-hearted, very clear, very politically correct, but embedded underneath are all kinds of unstated norms, biases, and implicit culture or values. There are informal sites of power and influence and invisible boundaries and exclusions. And Janet is going to speak more to these. So that even social movements that seem very progressive and very radical can, for instance, have horrendous stories of gender discrimination happening inside. You can have horrendous stories of violence against women by movement members and the movement hushing it up or refusing to allow the women to file a complaint and so on. These kinds of things are happening all the time. And women's movements can be equally exclusionary of other women because they decide that, well, you know, if you're a transgender person, well, you don't really belong in our movement. Or if you're disabled, well, poor you, you know, we'll give you a wheelchair and we'll give you a ramp, but we're not really interested in hearing your political perspective. So there are different ways in which the processes of exclusion happen. So basically, just to conclude that we also have to look at social justice movements as microcosms of the societies in which they emerge. So they have great power for transformation, but they can also reproduce unthinkingly all kinds of biases and exclusionary practices. Now I'm going to stop here. I'm sorry that I've taken much longer than I intended to, but if there are any questions, especially any clarificatory questions, because we'll have time again for a larger discussion and to connect these points about movements to the specific issues of disabled women's organizing. But right now, if you have any quick clarificatory questions that you'd like to ask, I'm open to take a couple of them.
So, Sri, there is a question by Paris. How are these large-scale movements financially sustained if the members themselves?
Okay, there, I see it. Well, there are different patterns. There's no kind of single norm that I can allude to. But I think what you will find is that the most successful movements in the long term are movements that are minimally dependent on external resources. They are mostly self-financed. And the most powerful movements are the ones where the movement's members, their constituency, basically mobilizes the resources for its activities. So if you look, for instance, at some of the struggles around, say, indigenous land rights, displacement by large dam projects, displacement by nuclear power projects, things like that, you'll see that those movements get very little money from outside. And in fact, now there is an environment, especially in countries like India, where it's become increasingly difficult for movements to get outside resources without being termed terrorists, that you're being funded by foreign interests who are trying to destabilize our country and so on. So it's actually become very difficult for movement building processes to get money from outside, especially from outside the country. So most large-scale, long-term successful movements are self-financed.
Thank you, Sri. There's another question from EFLI. What is the difference between reactionary movements and responding to sparks of outrage?
Well, they're two different things. Reactionary movements are, it's the terminology I use for movements that are being built, including mobilizing women, by the way. Large numbers of women have been mobilized by reactionary movements, with an agenda which in the long term, although it may seem attractive to women in the short term because they give women a lot of space in those movements to be the foot soldiers, the organizers, the mobilizers, the long-term agenda of these movements is reactionary. It's not in favor of an advancement of a broad range of human rights, and especially rights like gender equality and the rights of sexual minorities. And that's why I'm calling them reactionary, because they are usually working towards a political vision which is backward looking, that, you know, things were so glorious in the days of whatever. And, you know, when women knew their place and they stayed at home and they played the role that God intended for them, and men went out and did ABC, which is the role God intended for them. You know, these kinds of agendas. It's essentially the Taliban closing all schools for girls in the Swat Valley in Pakistan. It is a traditional caste panchayat in India issuing a diktat that no teenage girl after 13 should be allowed to go to school or have a cell phone. These are what I call reactionary movements. Sparks of outrage are totally different. The reactionary movement can in fact create the spark of outrage, because, and that's why I mentioned the Taliban's action in Swat, because Malala Yousafzai, and I hope you've all heard of her, the young woman who was shot for trying to go to school and for keeping the girls' school open, that was the spark of outrage that brought people out on the streets across the entire country in Pakistan. That this can't happen. We can't allow this kind of reactionary agenda to take over our country. So I'm not sure why you're connecting these two. They are sometimes connected, because even reactionary movements sometimes begin out of a sense of outrage. So the spark of outrage is located in a different place conceptually as a possible trigger for a movement building. And the movements that get triggered and built out of the spark of outrage can be reactionary or they can be progressive. I'm not sure I've answered your question. NGO's role, could a movement also be a group of like-minded NGOs, partners? Yes, it can. You can have movements that are built of, networks of organizations. I think AVID is one such. We consider ourselves a part of what we call a global women's movement. And what is a global women's movement? It is a collection of women's rights organizations around the world. Some of our members are movements also. We have very strong membership of movement-based organizations, but we can also, unfortunately in this session there isn't time for us to discuss the difference between movements and organizations, but I really encourage you to read that whole section of Changing Their World. I think it will give you a lot of clarity, because yes, movements can get together and build, and organizations can get together and build. The difference between feminist movements and women's movements was not clear to you. Okay, let's quickly go back and see if we can look at that. See, the basic difference is that a feminist movement uses a very clearly feminist analytical lens to build its political agenda. It says there is something called patriarchy, and patriarchy is an organizing structure in society. It's a power structure in society, just like caste, class, race, ethnicity, ability, sexual orientation. All these become the basis for social power, resource control, etc. So a feminist movement starts with that starting point, that we believe that there are these structures of power that need to be changed. If we don't change them, women can never get equality in society. That is what a feminist movement would say. What a women's movement would say is, we think it's very unfair that women aren't getting the services they deserve. They aren't getting equal opportunity for education. They aren't getting equal access to healthcare or jobs or economic resources or whatever. But they are not understanding that, or not necessarily beginning with an understanding of the deeper structures of power that result in these inequalities. So you can say a women's movement is like a pre-feminist movement. It's not yet ready to make that leap, but it often does make that leap. Okay, I think we should now perhaps stop and move on to the next section, because Janet's got quite a substantial presentation. So I'm going to hand over to her now and request you to hold on to your other questions. They may get deepened or nuanced once you listen to Janet and look at the whole issue of movement building in the context of disabled women. So Janet, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sri, and thank you for that presentation. It's always great to hear it, because I think however many times I think about how we make our movements, it just adds extra layers to my analysis and my understanding. What I wanted to start with, one of the questions that we asked you in the homework we gave you was whether any of you had been involved with the disabled women's movement. And I wonder if any of you, those that have, could just push a mark in the voting. Right. Small numbers. Right, that doesn't surprise me. And I'll talk a little bit today particularly about why I think there are so few women involved in movements, whether they're disabled movements or women's movements of any sort. Can you all hear me? There's one or two I can't hear you coming through. Are you hearing me? Yes? Yes, good. Right, I'll continue that. Right, what I want to do today, just I'll talk very briefly about naming in the disability movement because I think that's a fairly crucial issue. And then I'm going on to talk about disabled women in movements from a variety of aspects. I think one of the crucial things is understanding gender and disability and what we're talking about when we're looking at those. Then I'll go on to explore some of the areas that Sri has been talking about in terms of organising movements, but look at what that might mean for disabled women. I'll then go on to look at some of the exclusionary practices and normative roles, these areas that Sri has called the deep structures and how they affect things. A little bit of history and how that affects the current day in terms of looking at the austerity strictures that we're facing today. And finally, looking at disabled women and their involvement in broader feminist organising. Okay. Where's the next one? I'm not as slick at this as Sri because I haven't done it all before, so on we go. Okay, ways of naming. When the UN Convention came in, a decision was made then by the people involved in it that they would use the terminology people with disabilities or women with disabilities, so a people first definition. I think that's fine, but I myself use an alternative definition. I talk about disabled women, so I put the disability first. Now I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and anxiety about naming in disability. And I'd like today to be an open space where people can use the language that is comfortable to them, but to hear and understand the reasons why people might choose a particular way of naming. For myself to use disabled women, it's because I grew up and came as part of the disability movement in the UK. And for me, it's part of claiming an identity as a disabled woman. My disability isn't something I can split off, it's part of my embodiment. And so for that, I put the disability first, followed by the woman. There's deeper reasons around embodiment that I'll go on to later. But basically what I want to say is please be open to what other women are saying. Don't jump on them because they use the wrong terminology, and think about why we use the language that we do around disability. Okay, so if we're going to think about creating a disabled women's movement, if disabled women are to organise, we have to know who they are. And so with women, we can understand, we've come over the years to understand the sex-gender split between biology and social construction. Now within disability, there's various ways of understanding it. Some of the non-political explanations, fate and superstition, which is very much tied up with fear, and the notion that disability will bring shame to the family, will bring ill health, will bring ill will upon people within it. There's a welfare or charity approach which sees disabled people as basically childlike, as needing support without actually being directly involved themselves in any activity. So they are done to rather than being actors. And then there's the medical approach, which has largely involved medical intervention, seeing, either operations, rehabilitation, with the doctors as heroes of process. So they're the ones that actually make the changes. Now, if we start to think a bit more clearly about political definitions, I want to move on to think about the social rights model. And what we see here is the difference between impairment and disability. Now, impairment is a lack or a defect in a part, a mechanism, or a whole of the biological body. So we've got a fairly anatomical or biological definition, a physical definition of a broken body. Disability, by contrast, they say, is the disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by contemporary societal organisation. So they're looking at the ways in which prejudice, discrimination, blocks in access arise around people so that they're excluded from mainstream social activities. So there's very clearly a social construction to disability. And the argument goes that if all barriers were removed, disabled individuals would be able to live freely and without discrimination in the world. Okay, so if we'll move on from that one, I'd like to offer a slight variation on this, which I think, looking at the writing over the years, offers more of a feminist line on it. And what we're looking at here is, with feminists, it really addresses the social model's failure to take account of the body within disability. So it's really looking at the way in which our sensations, our feelings, our emotions, they are seen as belonging purely to the realm of impairment and have no social construction around them. And that's really important because it excludes a whole vast area of experience. I'd like to suggest that if we can think not of the body, but of embodiment. Now this is really the way that we live in and through our bodies, and it talks about our relationship with others. So it incorporates relationships. So examples, it may be that my presence in a wheelchair makes you uncomfortable. I met a woman once at a conference who hadn't seen me for a while, and she looked at me and she said, "Janet, you're in a, well, how are you then?" And she couldn't actually say the word wheelchair because it just made her so uncomfortable. It may be about the way in which Malawi, having sex with disabled women, is believed to be a cure for HIV, so women there get raped. It may be about how a nurse in India doesn't believe a disabled woman is worthy of dignity, so she abuses her when she's giving birth and leaves her exposed for all walking past to see. So it's looking at these relationships, the acts of one upon another and how the others respond. And so I'm really trying to think about how into the notion of rights we bring ethics. And it's an ethics of relationship, which is really crucial if we're trying to build movements. We have to think about our relationships with those around us. So now I want to move on to talk about disabled women organising together and how that can happen, what the barriers are, how we can overcome them. Now, I've highlighted here three main issues which pick up on some of the areas that Sri was talking about. The requirement for disabled women to identify as disabled women or as women with disabilities, and to do so from a feminist perspective. So we need to start building an understanding of feminism and disability politics interwoven or intersecting. Second, we have to look at confronting the challenges of organising together, and this can be a major issue for disabled women. How do they actually find ways of meeting and planning together? And then we have to think about what analyses, what understanding we use for framing the political issues we face. So if we look at the political identification of disabled women, it's a bit like there was a quote from Simone de Beauvoir many years ago, that one is not born but becomes a woman. And I would say one is not born disabled but becomes a disabled woman. And it's this process of consciousness raising to recognise your identity. Now, it's 15% of people in the world are disabled. So that means 15% of women are disabled. But lots of women don't identify. They don't take a political stance. So perhaps your grandmother who walks with a stick because of her arthritis, a friend who's got severe postnatal depression, possibly worsened by the sterilisation they persuaded her to have, a young cousin who's got HIV. These are all disabled women, but from very different angles, with very different forms of embodiment. And how do we encourage them to recognise that they're disabled, that they face a pattern of discrimination, of lost chances, poor support, demeaning treatment? And these are all worsened because they're women, and so they're treated less well. Now, these are very different conditions. These women are faced by patterns of inequality and discrimination, and this has implications for how services are provided, how buildings and environments are organised, so how your grandmother can get around, how your best friend gets support, how your cousin is treated for her HIV. It's the discrimination that people face as part of a wider pattern of prejudice against disabled people. And we've got to really build that feminist disability analysis within it. And this is something that I think has been very difficult at a grassroots level. Okay. So, the challenges of organising together. Now, one of the first that all disabled women will recognise is that of access. How do you actually manage to come together so that you can be part of a group? You live in a rural area, you have to get a bus to go to a meeting, but the bus driver doesn't like disabled people and he refuses to stop for you, or he throws you off, as has happened to some disabled women. In the UK, 70% of women with disabilities said they have faced violence on local transport, whether verbal or physical. So that's massive. So how do we begin to approach this? Physical coming together is one issue, and clearly we need to look at access requirements. Another possibility, another option for coming together is looking at joining together on the web. Now, there's a group called the International Network of Women with Disabilities, and they were involved in negotiations around the convention. And there's a membership now of about 200, over 200 of them, I think. So it's one way that a group of women have come together. There's a membership there. There is the development of disability feminist analysis. So it's very clearly building its way towards being a movement. And just one thing I want to say in terms of access. Every woman with a disability will know that organising access, being disabled, costs money. It makes things much more expensive than they necessarily would be otherwise. And thirdly, I want to talk about framing political campaign issues. Again, Sri has talked about this, the need to analyse and determine exactly what's going on. So, for example, if there was violence against deaf women, you have to look at what that violence actually means. Does it mean talking behind their back? Does it mean refusing to give them hearing aids? Refusing to put new batteries in them? It's all forms of subtle and understated violence towards them. And there's other forms of violence against disabled women that aren't recognised in general violence. So you hide somebody's crutches, you refuse to translate something for them. It can go from things like that to the propensity for violence against disabled women. And the violence that we face has been shown to be higher than that against other women. So there's clearly a fear and a tendency to be violent. So again, building this analysis is really important. I think one of the problems with the rape of disabled women is that there's a tendency amongst non-disabled people to believe it's impossible because disabled women are asexual. They don't involve themselves in sex, and therefore who would want to rape them? Or they're ugly, why would you want to rape them? So there's a real need to raise consciousness about these things, to build feminist strategies that address a gender and disability issue. And it's a range of analysis, of research, of the discussion with people, of building your negotiation skills, challenging community norms around violence. Now, Swabiman is a group of Indian deaf women who've worked around this, and they basically built their skills around gender and sexual violence and gender and sexual rights. Their initial training was with a non-disabled feminist who had got to know them, and she learned a great deal from them. Now, they've grown as a group, and they have trained other groups, 7 or 8 other groups across North India. They're getting requests from the south of India, from Pakistan. They're looking towards, I would say, gradually building a movement as more and more deaf women become involved in issues around sexual violence. Now, one of the things that's been very noticeable is the ways in which disabled women haven't been a large part of disability movements or feminist or women's movements. And the question is why? Disability movements have always been male-dominated, women restricted from taking positions of power. And I've heard many stories from all around the world of the ways in which women have been pushed out of positions and excluded from joining organizations or taking some sort of clear role within organizations. So if you have no involvement in a movement, you can't influence its analysis. And because men are gradually working towards the underlying norms of masculinity, because they don't want to be determined as feminine, which is the prejudice that is held to them because they're disabled, then you see this exclusion of women's issues. Within feminism, I think one of the things that has been noticeable is that feminists wanted to be seen as strong, healthy, independent. You know, they were trying to look at ways of presenting themselves as in control. So if you then incorporate into that a group of women who use personal assistance, who walk as though they're not in control of themselves, who don't talk clearly, all of the prejudices come out, and people think, well, we can't have these women in the group because, you know, they will feed all of these old myths about women as hysterics, as weak and feeble. They need to be excluded, possibly not consciously, but a place is not made for them within the movement. Okay. So I'm going to move on quite quickly here because I'm aware that time is going on, but I will put some notes about these slides upon the feedback that you receive from us. Just wanted to talk briefly about the era of austerity that we're living through at the moment, about the neoliberal forces that are really affecting many people's lives, and how that's affecting disability and feminist organising. Now, if we look back to the past, the colonial era, this was when disability began to take form as a known condition. To start with, during the colonial time, there were famines, many caused by the actions of foreign rulers. Indigenous communities were displaced and starved. There were eugenic policies which aimed to kill off people who were not seen as fitting the right notion of who should belong. So with all of these, and with the fact that the East India Company actually defined able-bodied. These were the people that they wanted to come and work for them. So if you have the able-bodied, you gradually begin to develop this notion of those who are not able-bodied, who are not appropriate to work for you. And you have this constitution of disability-like conditions and contexts created for many within colonized countries. Now, in the current era, what we're seeing with this global downturn is that we've got a reduction in welfare spending, we've got an economic squeeze, and we've got similar sorts of patterns affecting many of us. We've got these powerful forces pushing certain groups, and I'm very aware within the UK, disabled people have been the ones that the government has chosen to scapegoat throughout the period of funding, reduced funding, when we've been going through an economic depression. So it really is important to understand and to look both to the past and the present to understand exactly what is happening with us. Now, there's a variety of forces that are controlling this. The state, we're very aware of that and the way in which it determines the limits of disability, that we often have to campaign against the state for the way in which it will or won't support disabled people, the education they get, those sorts of things. I think one thing though to be aware of is what Robert McClure has called a metropolitan group. And these are people who go round on the conference circuit perhaps, who receive all the reports, who maybe are part of the UN system. Some of them are very connected to the bodies that they're, or the groups that they're dealing with. Some of them are really quite divorced from them. But one of the things that happens is, for example, it was this metropolitan group that determined we would be people with disabilities. And that, they said, had flowed up from the organisations that they worked with. But we must be very aware that there are only a very small number of disabled organisations that we could truly call disability movements in the world today. And so it's interesting to think about this notion of naming and who and where it's come from. So all of this really is thinking about the ways in which we can develop disability feminist tactics to raise questions, to look at resistance, negotiation, building alliances with different organisations, with different groups. Now, just finally and quickly, I wanted to look at disabled women involved in feminist organising. As I said, disabled women are 15% of all populations. And one of the founding statements of the disability movement was nothing about us without us. So if as non-feminists you want to include disabled women more in your work, you have to find ways of reaching out to them, not expecting them to come to you. You need to set up proper access for them if you're meeting. You need to listen to their analyses. So this 15% of women should be at the centre of the women's movement. They are some of the most disadvantaged around, and so we have to look at ways of ensuring that they're included. We can start off with many practical approaches, and I've offered here a range of practical suggestions about how to go about this. But what I want to do is share with you two very clear examples. The first one was of the deaf women's group that I showed you earlier. And there was a non-disabled woman who had gradually been increasing her understanding of the disability movement, and she reached out and made contact with them. And what gradually emerged was the possibility of her doing training with them around gender, sexuality, sexual rights and violence, and of her learning from them about disability and death issues. So there was a mutual exchange of understanding of the problems and issues that were faced, and the building more coherently of an analysis of how violence, for example, affected deaf women. And this has now resulted in these large group of women being trained and going out to train others. The second example is of an Indian feminist sexual rights group who set up a program against violence called Count Me In. They involve different groups of marginalized women, sex workers, lesbians, disabled women, single women, and they address sexual and reproductive health and rights and anti-violence strategies. And disabled women were fully involved in the whole planning of the conference. And they were part and parcel of a series of different groups of marginalized women. They did research around the violence that they faced, fed the research into the conference, asked disabled women to do papers for it, and they ensured when the conference was set up, they supported many disabled women to go to it, but that the venue was accessible to the extent of demanding that the hotel build extra rooms because they didn't have any wheelchair accessible rooms. And I've been in a similar situation myself about 5 years past. So it's actually, we have to push these changes. They are not going to come about easily. And if disabled women are going to be part of feminist movements, then feminism has to learn how to create the space for them. In conclusion, I just wanted to put in a short bit of a
yes, sure. I'll put it in
tape that has been made.
A URL.
Leila, can you pull this up for me? I don't even know.
Thank you, Jen.
Just play a short piece of it. It's a group of young disabled women who are away on a training session in Canada?
And it's in I think it's in Oregon, in the U.S.
Oregon, right.
So it should start now.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Is it able to come, Leila?
Hey, Janet?
Yes, I'm not seeing it. I don't know whether others are.
Are you, is everyone seeing and or hearing the video?
Yes. Yeah. Okay, just me then.
Okay, let me try to.
Right. I just wanted to show a short clip of it because it is these powerful young women who have come together to analyse and work around what is happening in their lives.
Do you want me to play a little bit longer, or?
I don't know. You stop it when you think it's appropriate because I can't see it for some bizarre reason.
Okay. I'll play it for another minute or two because it's a really powerful video. So I think that will be okay, Janet?
Yeah, great.
Okay, great. So go back to the slide.
Yeah. Right. Well, I wanted to end the session, this part of the session there. But I don't know whether there are any points of just clarification before we open up for a general discussion. Is there anything that I said that you'd like to know a bit more about? I know some of it was theory and therefore a bit more difficult to grasp just in this short period, but I'm just looking through.
Janet, there's a question, or actually Johanna has raised her hand. So Johanna, if you want to ask a question, you can speak by pressing the talk button, or you can type in your question. Please go ahead.
All right, I'm just going to speak. So the last presentation, you said that there's 15% of all populations are women with disabilities. Where did you get that number?
There has recently been a very comprehensive report done by the WHO looking at disability around the world, and their conclusion was that on average, and clearly it differs slightly from country to country, but surprisingly not as much as one might think, but about 15% of people have disabilities. Now, if you remember here, the disabilities include people with mental health problems, and that is a growing epidemic of disability around the world. It involves people injured by wars, the whole range of issues that are emerging that are creating disabilities. There was a thing on the radio this morning saying people in China are dying 5 years earlier because of pollution. So there's going to be a really big issue there about disability because of chest and breathing related concerns. So I think our understanding of disability has to grow beyond some of the standard notions of people in wheelchairs, deaf people, visual impaired people. It has to expand to include a much broader range of people, including people with HIV. And there was a group of people I met the other day from South Africa who had been doing some work with an artist. And they said when she came, we didn't know that we were disabled. She had to tell us. Now there's an interesting question about how you then work around that disability, that notion of disability for people with HIV being an awareness raising, a consciousness raising move, rather than simply a move that definition that moves you sideways into a position where you might be able to claim benefits or other provisions from the state. So this notion of what disability is and how you understand it is a really important one. And I think that's why these young women from MIUSA are so fabulous, because they have a real sense of themselves as disabled women and of how they want to present themselves to the world. What I want to do is turn them into a feminist movement. That's not happened yet.
All right, so I think I just misunderstood, because I think you were talking about the World Report on Disability, and I thought you said that it's 15% that are women with disabilities, but actually that report says that 15% are persons with disabilities, so actually it would be 7.5%, right?
No. Okay, sorry, 15% of women will be disabled, is what I meant. So it's 15% of women, 15% of men. Yeah?
Yeah, all right, thanks.
Okay, yeah, sorry, Jo. Okay, any other questions?
Janet, I think the question that Lorena has posed is quite an interesting one. As a women's rights fund in Latin America, which has not yet worked on this issue, how would you recommend that we approach it?
I think this is a really challenging one, because for so long groups haven't been involved in disability, and to actually start that connection. I think one of the ways I would suggest is to start working with the groups that you're already involved in, and to encourage them to include disabled people, disabled women, in the work that they're doing. Now, for example, again, I'm going to refer to Kriya, the Indian group I've been connected with. They're now working in some of the rural areas of India, and what they've done in those areas is set up women's or young girls' sports activities for teenage girls, you know, and in this sense they're using the sports activities as a way of bringing the young women together to talk about many of the issues that affect their lives that they can't speak about in other contexts. And within that, they have made absolutely sure that they've gone around the village and included disabled young women within that group. So even if they can't stand up and play football, they've found games that they can play. And there is always a game that every disabled person can play pretty much. I mean, I think the Paralympics showed us that there's a very broad range of things available. But I think it's more about the inclusion as much as anything. And if you begin to see disabled women on a day-to-day level within those groups, it then becomes possible to also think of them as having, you know, additional or different sets of needs that are intersecting that you have to ensure are always addressed, so that those needs are met. I mean, in preparing this presentation, we thought very carefully about how we could ensure that it was accessible to a range of people, of women with different disabilities. And so again, it's about putting in place these sorts of moves so that then when you go out into the field, I think what doesn't work is to imagine you can go out and start a disabled women's program without any representation of disabled people at a local level. One possibility might be to get involved with something like MIUSA, and if there are young women in countries you have a lot of involvement, see if there are ways you can form alliances with them and build and support the work that they're doing through that. There are a whole group of young women that I know of who are starting small organizations who are really struggling for funding, but who are the ones who are going to reach out to other women within their areas to be able to support them. So I think there are 2-3 ways that you know, it can be done, but it's not easy because there has been such a long history of not taking notice. And to suddenly turn around and take notice raises suspicions, makes people wary, and also if you do it without a real understanding of what it is you're moving into, I think it can be counterproductive. You can just confirm in people's minds the notion that disabled women are too much trouble, or that their needs are too demanding, or there's a whole pile of stereotypes that float around. So does that offer some sort of hope as ways you could begin to think about this?
Lorena?
Lorena, does that offer you some ideas?
No. Sorry, I think Lorena has set in a question. Any successful cases of working with traditional, in quotation marks, male-dominated disability organizations? So are there any successful cases? Sorry,
before you get to that, Janet, before you get to that, I think there's an interesting question from Mokum, who asks you to explain the point you made at the beginning of your presentation. She says, may I know why only a few women are involved in movements? Because I think you made the point that there are not many women involved in movements, and out of them even fewer are disabled women.
I mean, I'm talking, you know, from my personal experience and from the reading I've done. But I think one of the issues, Mukam, is the massive barriers that women face. I mean, the story I told about a disabled woman being thrown off a bus when she tried to get on it to go to a meeting is not made up. It was something that happened. And so for disabled women particularly, I think there are massive barriers to actually coming together. And this is where I think the issue of the energy, the time, the exhaustion, the pain, all the invisible aspects of disabilities are really important. I noticed somebody said that they've got lupus and it was very disabling, but nobody can see it. I think many, many women have disabilities that nobody is ever aware of, and they live with pain, with exhaustion. They don't talk about it particularly, and so it just it stays as this secret. And I think one of the things that maybe we need to find a way of doing is actually bringing some of these issues out into the open so that we can talk about them, recognize them, and make connections with each other more clearly about it. It was what used to be known as consciousness raising 30 years ago when I was first a young feminist. But I think the barriers against women coming together, we frighten men. Powerful women frighten men. I think that is really how, a sort of bottom line for me. And so if we come together as as an organization of women, challenging patriarchy, even if we're not necessarily challenging individual men, the men in our households, but the structures that they've built, that is very scary for them. And so they will do a great deal to put barriers in our way. And then there are many barriers already there. We live in a patriarchal society, and these structures have already been built that prevent us meeting, coming together, analysing what's happening, the possibilities for that. Does that
yes,
make sense? Does it fit with your experience of where you live and work?
Janet, I wonder if I may direct your attention to another point that's come up, which I think both of us need to address. I think this has been reposted by Kumud. I didn't see a posting by Sham first, where he says, I'd like to know if women not being able to stand up for their rights could be called a disability. If yes, maybe perpetrators of violence could also be called disabled since they're unable to control themselves or whatever. I think this is an interesting question because it kind of raises the point of how useful is it to expand a concept to a level where everybody fits inside it. Does that actually help us politically to raise the visibility and voice of a set of people who are marginalized or excluded in a particular way? We're saying, oh, it's not just you, everybody is disabled. I can't speak in my village meeting, so I'm disabled. My husband beats me, I'm disabled. So I think we need to address this point that, well, what is the point here? What are we gaining by expanding the concept of disability so wide that everybody is disabled? Does that serve a useful social change purpose? Let me throw the question back to you. I think that's how I would like to respond to it. So I want you to respond to it as well.
Okay. I think this is a difficult question. One of the interesting things about the UN Convention is it doesn't give a closed definition of what a disability is. it gives a culturally relevant one. So disabilities may vary from country to country, from place to place, and it's about what they decide to incorporate in law, what they decide to designate as disability, and how they pull that together. I think the way in which disability can be expanded is problematic, because it's very clear that there are people who have very severe physical changes to their body that are acted on by culture, which makes it worse. This is where the issue of embodiment, it's not simply the body itself, but it's the relationship with a culture which doesn't provide access, which doesn't support, which doesn't address pain, all of these things. But how far out is it useful to take that? I know that a lot of disabled women get very angry when non-disabled people use the concept disability to say, I'm a woman and therefore I'm disabled too. Yeah. And I think there is an issue about keeping separate this understanding of a particular group for whom we need to address the embodied, in part physical, maybe in part emotional, mental, psychosocial changes that are happening to them that are severe, and for which they may need support, they may need access provision. There are changes we need to make within society for them. And one of the things I didn't talk about was the very powerful norms of ability that those people who aren't disabled live with this unspoken norm of ability, or what I would call compulsory able-bodiedness. And society is full of provisions for them. The chairs, the steps, the loudspeakers, a variety of ways in which provisions are made. And they don't see that those provisions are being made for a majority, but the smaller provisions that are needed for the minority of people who either use wheelchairs or who need a disability loop rather than loudspeakers, or who need audio description and who need a sign interpreter, that those are provisions they see as being separate. So I think to actually recognize the privilege of ability and not turn it into, oh, we're all disabled because, you know, we're women or whatever. There is something very different about having something happen to your embodiment or to the way that your mind, your emotions work, that you are prevented from functioning on a day-to-day level. And that's, I think it's really important to, I don't know, but the trouble is there's no way that you can draw an exact line, because it does vary from culture to culture depending upon what actions, what values are specific to that culture or to another culture. So it's a variable one, but I think it is important to draw a distinction, but certainly for me it is.
I want to just conclude the discussion of this point, because I happen to feel rather strongly about it as a person who is on her way to being disabled, but has had a life of privilege as more able-bodied or relatively more able-bodied. I want to ask the question, since this is a learning session, let's take this question back to ourselves and say, why do we need the notion of disability to address the oppressions women face in terms of violence in their daily lives, etc., etc.? Right? Why? Let's ask, why do we need that concept? Is it because we've run short of other concepts? We have not. I'm sorry. We have a huge body of conceptual and strategic thinking that has been done by feminists in the last 50 years to give us beautiful, powerful constructs to explain things like violence against women, subordination of women in their intimate sphere, in their personal and daily lives, etc., etc. We have a powerful, toolbox of concepts and definitions. And disabled people have struggled to get a conceptual framing that is forcing others to recognize the particularities of their experience of exclusion, the particular forms that their exploitation and marginalization takes. Why do we want to take away their conceptual framework? We've got plenty of our own, is what I'm trying to say. It is not useful. It is going to weaken and further damage the disability rights movement to say everybody is disabled. So please let us not go in that direction, because we have plenty of our own tools and ways of framing the structures of stigma and subordination that the other 85% of women experience. I just want to make this point very strongly, and I hope I've been clear why, and I hope you understand why I'm making it.
Yes, I think I'd support you in saying that we need to make this distinction, because I think when people say they're disabled as women, they're talking about different structural forms or a different structural and patriarchal oppression that disabled women face too. They face that, but they face other things in addition to it. And I think one of the things that people have struggled with enormously is to change or move disabled people in general from being a group whom we regard as worthy of welfare to a group whom we apply the notion of human rights to. And I think it comes through in the unwillingness to actually grant them the right to, in a sense, an understanding of how their oppression works, that people creep into it from other directions because they don't understand fully what the difficulties and challenges and prejudice of being a disabled person are.
Right. I think Shweta's posting in the discussion in the chat section is very powerful, and Heather's as well. So I'd encourage everybody to read that.
Yes, yes.
It's very powerful. The notion of drowning out. I really like that image. When larger movements drown out the voice.
Yes.
Okay. I think since we're coming almost to, how are we doing on time, Laila? Do you want to remind us?
Yeah, well, it's about time to end soon, but if there are still questions, and if both you and Janet and other participants can stay on a few more minutes, everyone's welcome to do that.
Can I invite participants, if there are any remaining burning questions or things you want to share, experiences you want to share, please do come in. We're more than happy to stay a few minutes.
I think Shweta has raised her hand.
Okay, go ahead, Shweta.
Yeah, I'm just going to try and talk, but if it's not audible, then I can type it in. So I think I just want to go back to the point of funding that we were talking about after Shree's presentation. And you said that many of the successful movements are sort of self-sustaining. So I don't know if there's space for this in this particular discussion, or maybe you can just send links later. But I just want to know, what do you mean by self-sustaining? Are donors part of this movement then? Are they are they part of that substructure that you were talking about, or do organizations sort of fund it in a different way? Like, I'm still finding it very hard to sort of understand what the source might be.
It's usually member fees and individual contributions. So if you look at MKSS, let me talk about a very specific movement, or let me contrast two movements, okay? One is the International Slum and Shack Dwellers movement, okay? It's called Shack Dwellers International. And one is the Farmers, Peasants and Workers movement in Rajasthan, MKSS, okay? Mazdoor Kisan Sangharsh Samiti. So if you look at these two, MKSS doesn't take grants from any donor, doesn't take institutional grants, okay? It is financed by its own members. They pay a membership fee. It's like a union. So I pay a monthly fee, and through that fee, some of the basic activities of the Samiti are sustained, the meetings, rallies. Now, if there's a rally, a protest march, recently they had a public hearing on violence against women, special events like that, those events are sponsored through individual donations. Like I send money to MKSS regularly as an individual contributor, and they raise money locally from people who are sympathetic to the cause. They hold the event. But people also contribute in kind. They'll come, they'll construct the kind of camp in which the event is going to be held, so their labor is free. They'll pay for their own food for that day. They pay for their transport, whatever. So actually there's a very high level of contribution to sustaining that movement. If you think about the fact that these are very, very poor people who are sharing their wages to hold these events, but that's the level of their investment in that movement, a level of faith and commitment to it. Shack Dwellers International has a different model, where the local slum dwellers federations are self-financing. They collect money from their members monthly basis for the local activities, but they have a few paid activists, and the paid activists get their salaries routed through the NGO with which that Slum Dwellers Federation partners at the local level. So there's an NGO movement link there. There's a relationship. There is a movement building NGO that routes money from donors. So they have had situations where donors have said, we don't think you should be doing this kind of work. We think you should be doing that kind of work. Or if the government has offered 300 plots of land for some of your members, why aren't they taking it? That kind of thing. So, there's a little more donor control. Now, right now in that movement, the Shack Dwellers movement has very strong leadership, both at the Slum Federation level as well as in the NGO partner level. So they've been able to negotiate and resist a lot of this pressure. But there are other movements where that hasn't been possible. But these are a couple of the ways in which they are self-sustaining. But to come to that point of becoming that self-sustaining, the sense of solidarity and the sense of ownership of that movement has to be very, very high.
Thank you, Shri.
I can send you some more literature about this, Shweta.
Yeah, that would be very helpful, actually. Thank you so much.
And I noticed there's quite a few people asking about literature about violence against disabled women, about sexual violence. There is a growing amount of literature, and I'll make sure I put some of the references to it in what we send out to you. But interestingly, it's an area that WHO have started doing research on at the moment with the support of disabled people. So they're beginning to look at some of these questions and take the violence that is inflicted upon disabled women much more seriously. Because as some of you have said, it often happens in secret, in places where people don't have control, have very great difficulty in getting away from the people who are violent against them because they're their carers or because they are people within institutions, and we know that institutionally there is a massive amount of violence that disabled people face. So there is growing recognition of this. The challenge now is to work out how we provide good support for people with disabilities around the world, because the model that the West has adopted of independent living and individual assistance is probably not one that is going to work internationally, and certainly in discussions with friends from parts of India and Africa, it's been a model that they do not see as going forward. So we also have to be thinking about ways forward in which we are able to support the needs of those within our families who have disabilities, and become advocates alongside them for the things that they need to live good lives. And I think that is what so much of this is about, to move from living a life that is filled with fear and horror and uncertainty to a life which has some level of, what I would call, flourishing, to actually feel that your life has potential.
Right. Well, I think it's time to bring our session to a close. I'm really not going to try and wrap up because this was a very, I think, complex and nuanced discussion. I do want to thank and congratulate participants though, because I noticed that you've used the chat pane very effectively to actually address each other's questions. So for example, I was going to take up the clarification of the definition of gender-based violence and violence against women, but I see that the participants have themselves clarified that the gender-based violence includes, for instance, violence against transgender people or people with different kind of gender identities. So it's not just women, but a whole range of other gender identities. It's violence committed because of your gender identity, whereas violence against women is just that, it's violence against women and girls. So you've been answering each other's questions. I also noticed that people have shared a number of very interesting web resources and readings and films and so on. So I think what we'll try to do is to put all this together into a paper that we can share with you, along with those of you who want to share each other's email addresses and stay in the conversation. And you know, maybe there are spaces that Janet could suggest through email, where those of you who are interested in continuing the conversation on you know, organizing from within positions of particular disadvantage or exclusion, like disability, or those of you who are specifically interested in pursuing a longer conversation about disability-based organizing and so on, please do that. I just want to thank everybody because I think it's been a very good session, a good discussion. I'm sorry that there wasn't more time and space to hear your voices and experiences, but thank you for being so patient and for participating so actively and effectively through the chat pane. It's really great to see that you're so comfortable with this technology. We would also love to hear more from people like Julia, how this whole platform was in terms of accessibility. Did you find it satisfying and enabling of participation? Because we'd really like to consider doing more sessions like this. So all I can say is, please do read all the rich material that's available on the AVID website, materials that Janet has pointed you to, and watch this space because we are really committed to continuing this conversation on movements and movement building and why they matter, especially for advancing women's rights. So I'm signing off as Srilata. Thank you for joining us, and over to you, Janet, if you want to say a few words of farewell.
Yes, I've really enjoyed it. I found it a strange experience to relate to the typing coming up. But one of the things actually that I really enjoy about working with other disabled people is that you never know what their access needs are going to bring. So in situations where access needs are being fulfilled, I always find that I learn more because there are different ways of providing information to people and different ways of thinking about how that information can work. So it becomes a much richer picture. But I've really enjoyed today. I will make sure I put a series of references out for you to look at. And I've been really interested in if there is an ongoing chat about disability movements and how it's possible to build those and where we can go. And somebody asked about, did anyone know of good young women who could give presentations? I know of 3 or 4, so please get in touch with me directly. And thank you very much for all your input, all your questions, which have challenged my brain to climb out of its rather double visioned position today and work well. So thank you. And I'm signing off here.
Hi, this is Layla. Just before everyone logs off, I also wanted to thank you all for joining us from different parts of the world, and we hope that it was interesting for you and a good learning experience and something that you can share and also keep the discussion going. And a big thank you to both Srilata and Janet for being with us today. And please also, we will send you an evaluation form after the session, and it would be really great if you could fill it out because the feedback will help us make further webinars even better. So, and any delayed comments, questions, or reactions, please feel free to write to us. You can write to layla@awid.org. Thank you, everyone, and take care.
Good night.